Before Brazil was Brazil, before the names Amazon and jungle ever echoed through foreign tongues, there were voices already there. Ancient voices speaking the language of the trees, of rivers, of thunder. These voices belonged to the Munduruku and the Kayapo. They were not just people, they were guardians. Guardians of a living world so vast, so untamed, that even the stars had to peer carefully through its canopy to see what stirred beneath. The jungle was not a backdrop. It was a breathing, roaring entity. Every leaf held a whisper. Every river stone remembered footsteps from centuries before. It was a place that did not forgive weakness. And so, the tribes that survived here did not merely live, they ruled. And among them, the Munduruku and the Kayapo became legends. The Munduruku, known once as the Decapitators, were feared and honored across the rainforest. Their warriors moved like jaguars and struck like thunderbolts. Each man bore tattoos, not for decoration, but to mark how many enemies he had vanquished. They painted their bodies in bold reds and blacks, symbols of blood and death, of courage and the river gods. And in the heart of their village, the heads of fallen enemies were preserved as trophies, not for cruelty, but as eternal reminders that the forest chose the strong. Far to the east, the Kayapo painted their world with different colors. They wore feathers that shimmered like the sun, and their war cries echoed like lightning strikes. To outsiders, their rituals seemed wild. But to the Kayapo, it was how the spirits were called, how nature was balanced. They were not just warriors. They were philosophers of the wild. Every child knew that the river spoke, the wind warned, and the jaguar could carry your soul if you died unworthy. But this land was not always war. Before blood was spilled between the Munduruku and Kayapo, there was something older. A fragile peace, born of distance and fear. Fear not of each other, but of what lay beyond. The true enemy was not a man, but a creeping shadow. One that moved through trees with steel in its hands and crossed in its words. The Portuguese had come, not knowing the names of those they would burn. They brought disease, slavery, and maps, lines that would one day erase whole nations. Munduruku resisted early. They raided slavers, ambushed canoes, and cut down soldiers who dared cross their sacred rivers. The Kayapo, meanwhile, turned to strategy, forging temporary alliances, then disappearing into the trees when betrayal came, as it always did. The forest fought with them. Poisoned arrows, river ambushes, hidden trails known only to the birds. For a time it worked, but as generations passed, something changed. The world outside grew louder. Guns replaced spears. Gold fever crept into the rivers. And the outsiders did not leave. They built cities at the jungle's edge and called them progress. They took children. They built roads through sacred ground. And worse, they pitted tribe against tribe. And so it began. Not a war over land, but a war for memory, for survival, for the soul of the forest itself. And in this war, the Munduruku and the Kayapo, once distant, once wary, would become fire and thunder, each their own storm, each refusing to vanish. In the time when the rivers still sang in undisturbed rhythms, the Munduruku rose as one of the fiercest warrior societies in the Amazon basin. Their name once struck dread into every neighboring tribe, not because of cruelty, but because of what they symbolized. A tribe that had mastered the art of organized warfare in a world ruled by chaos. They called themselves Wujiu, the Red Ants. To Munduruku, this was not an insult. Red ants, after all, did not simply fight. They swarmed, they coordinated, they overwhelmed. It was not the lone warrior that gave them power, but the collective will. A unit that moved as one, struck with precision, and vanished before the trees could whisper what had happened. Their raids were legendary. For miles, rivers bore the silent wake of Munduruku war canoes, blackened by smoke, lined with warriors painted in red urucum dye, bodies adorned with feathers and jaguar teeth. They would travel silently under the cover of early morning mist, sometimes for days, never lighting fires, never speaking loud. When they struck, it was sudden. They attacked villages with terrifying force, seizing trophies and heads. To the outsider, it may sound barbaric. But in the worldview of the Munduruku, headhunting was sacred. The human head, they believed, held not just the brain, but the very essence of courage. To take the head of a warrior was to honor his bravery and absorb his spirit into your own. The heads were smoked, preserved, and kept in sacred houses, not as macabre decorations, but as eternal companions in the realm of the living. Children were raised with these beliefs. A boy was not a man until he had proven himself in battle. A man was not a warrior until he had taken a head. And a warrior could not speak with the ancestors until he had spilled blood to protect the tribe. And yet, the Munduruku were not mindless killers. Their society was structured. They had councils, priests, astronomers. They mapped the stars and followed lunar cycles for planting and fishing. They had intricate social rules, songs passed from generation to generation, and an oral history that stretched back beyond memory. They believed that they descended from a supernatural being named Kayapo, who had created the first Munduruku from the heart of the river and given them the right to rule its flow. It was under this divine order that they expanded their domain, carving a name from the Tapajos River to the Madeira. They dominated the central Amazon for over 100 years, making peace with some, war with others. Their dominance was so complete that even colonial powers began to pay attention, not as conquerors, but as those who feared retaliation. But the jungle has a way of balancing power. While the Munduruku were feared in the central Amazon, another force stirred to the south and east, a people who did not hide, who wore their power like a second skin. They called themselves Mebengoker, the men from the water's source. The world would come to know them as the Kayapo. And unlike the Munduruku, they did not take heads. They took the land, and they made it memorable. To speak of the Kayapo is to speak of defiance, of a people who refused to be erased, not by the jungle, not by invaders, not even by time itself. Where the Munduruku were shadows and silence, the Kayapo were thunder and spectacle. They did not hide. They announced themselves with pride, bodies glowing with paint, lips pierced with vibrant discs, headdresses rising like flames into the sky. They were not just warriors. They were walking statements: we are here and we will not move. The Kayapo homeland was vast, spreading across what is now the eastern Amazon. Dense forests, river valleys, and scattered savannas. They were not confined to one village or region, but moved with the seasons, establishing powerful settlements across what outsiders would one day call Mato Grosso and Para. Their way of life was deeply embedded in a philosophy that saw the forest not just as home, but as kin. Trees were ancestors, rivers were lifelines, animals were messengers, and the land was sacred, to be protected, defended, and honored with song, story, and war. The Kayapo were famous for their body art, but this was far more than beauty. Their paint was a language. Black represented the power of the night, of warfare, of strength. Red symbolized life, community, and courage. Children, men, women, all took part in ceremonies where patterns were painted on their skin to tell the stories of their roles, dreams, and destinies. Their lip plates, worn by men, were not marks of savagery, as colonists would later mockingly suggest, but marks of maturity and connection to the divine. Each adornment, each scar, each piece of jewelry was an identity carved in time. Unlike the Munduruku, who moved like military units, the Kayapo fought like nature itself. Loud, chaotic, overwhelming. Their battle dances could last for days. They would storm into enemy territories with chants that mimicked thunder, wielding spears, clubs, and later, even captured firearms. But always, the Kayapo carried a memory into battle. Every raid, every defense was a retelling of an old story. The spirits of the jungle marched with them, And the Kayapo were not just warriors of the blade. They were warriors of speech. Their orators, powerful men known as Medoro, would speak for hours before a battle or ritual, weaving tales of ancestors, gods, and justice. In the longhouses, where communities gathered in the heart of the night, these speeches carved laws deeper than any stone. Words were weapons, stories were shields, and silence was never an option. But what made the Kayapo truly formidable was their unity in identity. Each village was independent, yet shared language, rituals, and mythologies. They trained their youth in the ways of war, agriculture, and cosmology. They knew the invaders would come, and they prepared not just to survive but to push back. And when the first waves of colonists arrived, loggers, missionaries, gold seekers, the Kayapo met them not with fear, but with ceremony, and then with spears. To the Kayapo, survival was not submission. It was a confrontation. And unlike many tribes who fled deeper into the jungle, the Kayapo would go out into the world, to cities, to courtrooms, to cameras, and bring the fight there. But that battle was still to come. For now, as their villages glowed with firelight and their warriors painted their bodies under the rising moon, they turned their ears to the rivers. Because the Munduruku were stirring in the west. And soon, two powers would collide, not for dominance, but for the right to define what it meant to be the last guardians of the Amazon. There is a moment in every forest war when the trees fall silent, when even the parrots do not scream, and the monkeys vanish from the canopy. A moment before the first spear is thrown, when all creation holds its breath. In the heart of the Amazon, that moment came when the paths of the Munduruku and the Kayapo finally crossed. For generations, their territories had remained distant enough to avoid full conflict. They shared enemies: slavers, Portuguese invaders, Jesuit missionaries. Both tribes fought tooth and claw to defend their lands from outsiders who carried maps, crosses, and diseases. But eventually, the wave of colonization pressed deeper, forcing tribes closer and closer, until the space between the Munduruku and Kayapo vanished like mist at dawn. First, it was only stories. A scout from the Kayapo told of strangers in red paint watching from the trees. A Munduruku war party found a Kayapo arrow lodged in a tree on their western frontier. Children whispered of a rival tribe who danced with feathers and laughed before battle. And then, one morning, along a tributary of the Tapajos River, the silence shattered. A Kayapo village was found burned, bodies half hidden in the undergrowth. No plunder was taken. Only the dead remained and one missing head. The message was clear. Munduruku had made the first move. But why? No one tribe holds the truth. Some say it was retaliation, an old feud reignited over hunting grounds or captured women. Others say a shaman from the Munduruku had a vision, that if the Kayapo were not struck first, they would one day bring the downfall of all Amazonian peoples. Whether vision or vengeance, war had come, and the jungle would remember it for centuries. The Kayapo responded not with fear, but with fury. They gathered warriors from 5 villages, men with tattoos of lightning on their chests and spears blessed by the ancestors. Songs of war filled the night, and when the sun rose, they painted themselves in obsidian black. Morning color, battle color, death color. Their vengeance was brutal. A Munduruku outpost was surrounded and burned. Those who resisted were killed. The Kayapo took no heads, but left signs scorched into the soil. We are not prey. The conflict escalated into a cycle of revenge. Canoes moved silently down tributaries. Villages fortified their borders. Both tribes began crafting legends around the battles. Heroes who killed 10 men, warriors who died standing, children who carried blades before they could walk. But this was not just a war of men. It was a war of ideas. The Munduruku fought with ancient discipline, attacking in precision strikes, valuing fear and psychological dominance. Their headhunters became symbols of terror across the forest. Entire villages fled at the sight of their markings. The Kayapo, by contrast, embraced overwhelming force. Their warriors sang through battle, screamed the names of their ancestors, and fought like tempests. Where the Munduruku tried to frighten, the Kayapo tried to obliterate. For over a generation, the blood feud carved scars into the land. Rivers that once carried fish and song now carried bodies. Sacred groves became battlefields. The jungle, so often a sanctuary, became a graveyard of feathers, bones, and broken spears. And yet, neither tribe was defeated, because neither truly wanted conquest. What they wanted was space, memory, respect. But in the shrinking world of the colonial frontier, there was no more room for two storms to rage side by side. So the elders began to speak of visions. Dreams of the white ghost men from beyond the jungle who brought plagues in their breath. Dreams of giant iron roads that would split the forest open. Dreams of the rivers dying. And for the first time, the Kayapo and Munduruku wondered, was this war truly between them? Or were they both being hunted by something older and hungrier? While the Munduruku and Kayapo fought their sacred war, a deeper danger crept silently through the vines. It didn't wear feathers or paint. It didn't carry spears or chant beneath the moon. It came dressed in wool and metal with parchment and crosses. It came speaking in tongues the forest had never heard. It came not for blood but for land. The Portuguese had long claimed the Amazon on paper, drawing borders on maps that meant nothing to the spirits of the rivers. But now they came in flesh, slavers with muskets, missionaries with Bibles, explorers with endless greed, and behind them diseases with no mercy. The first wave of plague swept silently, smallpox, influenza, measles. It came in the breath of traders and in the water of stolen rivers. Entire villages, untouched by war, vanished in weeks. The jungle moaned with the loss of memory. Children died before their names could be spoken. Shamans burned herbs, begged the spirits, but the diseases did not listen. The Munduruku, already hardened by war, turned their fury toward the new threat. They raided colonial outposts, attacked slave caravans, and hunted Portuguese soldiers through the forest paths. Their ambushes were ruthless. They learned to cut off supply lines, to trap boats in narrow bends of the river, to disappear into the trees like ghosts of their own making. One colonial officer wrote in desperation, "They are devils in red paint. They speak no language we understand, and they die with smiles on their faces." To the Munduruku, death was not a defeat, it was transformation. And every fallen warrior became a jaguar in the next life, watching from the shadows. The Kayapo chose another path. They were not less brave, only more cunning. Rather than face the full weight of colonial armies, they used negotiation as a weapon. They approached some missionaries, tolerated certain traders, learned the names of European governors, only to manipulate alliances to their favor. They would make peace when it suited them, and when betrayal came, as it always did, they responded with fire. The Kayapo adopted stolen tools, iron blades, guns, mirrors, even clothing, and twisted them into their own traditions. A Kayapo warrior might carry a stolen musket, but fire it in the middle of a war dance to announce the spirit of battle had arrived. They learned the ways of the outsider but never bowed to them. Still, the colonizers kept pushing. They dug roads. They built missions. They enslaved whole villages of other tribes. And in doing so, they created a terrible truth. The Munduruku and Kayapo, once locked in blood feud, now shared a common enemy. Elders in both tribes began to speak with new words, of survival not just for their people, but for all those who still remembered the old ways. Whispers of diplomacy, once unthinkable, began to stir. But even as this new consciousness rose, tragedy struck again. In a series of retaliatory raids, the Portuguese unleashed one of the most brutal campaigns the Amazon had ever seen. They targeted not warriors, but crops. They burned fishing traps. They poisoned wells. They captured women and children, not to kill but to break the will of the tribes. And still, they failed, because the forest itself refused to surrender. And within its heart, the Kayapo and Munduruku remembered who they truly were: children of thunder, heirs of rivers, and guardians of a world the outsiders would never understand. The time had come for a different kind of war, not for revenge, but for survival. By the 1800s, the map of Brazil no longer belonged to the forest. It belonged to those who carved borders with ink and blood. Men in distant cities who had never heard the cries of howler monkeys at dawn or tasted the fear of stepping into a jaguar's shadow. To them, the Amazon was empty land waiting to be claimed. But the forest was far from empty, and its protectors were far from done. The pressure of colonization grew unbearable. Explorers and soldiers now arrived with steel tools, Catholic crosses, and political orders. Some came for rubber, others for gold. Most came for control. They believed the jungle was theirs to tame, and the people within it were merely obstacles. The Munduruku and Kayapo, once enemies, now stood at a threshold. They began to notice something chilling. Their war with each other had created openings for outsiders. Where Munduruku warriors had once guarded the Tapajos, foreign boats now passed freely. Where Kayapo villages once echoed with drums, missionaries now planted churches. Both tribes had blood on their hands, but the land they loved was bleeding more. It was in this grim realization that a strange transformation began. Some Munduruku chiefs, once revered for their success in raids, began meeting in secret with Kayapo elders. These were not formal councils. No treaty was signed. There were no drums, no firelit dances. Only quiet words were exchanged at riverbanks, often through third parties. Allied tribes, escaped captives, or old traders who had lived long enough to respect the forest. The message was simple: if we fight each other, we vanish. If we fight them, we endure. But unity did not come easily. Among both peoples, there were those who rejected peace. Young warriors who had trained their entire lives to fight the other, not the outsider. Elders who remembered burned villages, stolen children, sacred trees cut down and left to rot. Some warned that alliance would weaken tradition, that forgetting the past would doom the future. But the forest itself had changed. It no longer whispered songs of isolation. It screamed warnings of smoke. The sky was no longer always green. At dusk, a red haze settled over the canopy, the color not of sunset, but of burning. Loggers had arrived in force, armed not with axes but with machines that tore through centuries of life in minutes. The forest moaned beneath their wheels. They did not see trees, they saw timber. They did not see rivers, they saw cargo routes. They did not see people, they saw obstacles. And so the war changed shape. The Kayapo, even the diplomats of war, began using the enemy's tools against them. Some traveled to frontier towns, wearing headdresses and feathers, but speaking in harsh Portuguese to demand land rights. Others blocked highways, surrounding trucks with warriors painted in battle colors, forcing government officials to negotiate. They used the media like they once used spears, to shock, to strike, to survive. Munduruku took another path. They returned to the roots of jungle warfare, ambush, and sabotage. They began organizing night attacks against illegal logging camps. They burned equipment. They destroyed roads. They placed carved totems at the edges of cleared forests, warnings to the outsiders. You are not welcome. The spirits are watching. And sometimes, in the deeper corners of the jungle, it was said that Munduruku and Kayapo warriors fought together. Not in armies, but in the shadows. A joint raid here, a shared camp there. Stories began to emerge of warriors bearing the colors of both tribes, red and black, gold and green, standing side by side in defiance of those who would consume the forest whole. This alliance was not forged in peace. It was forged in fire. And though no treaty bound them, the forest did. Because only together could they defend what the outsiders never understood: that the Amazon was not a wilderness. It was a world, and it already had its kings. The forest had always been their battlefield. But now, the fight had reached strange places. Places with marble floors, electric lights, and words carved into law that no one in the jungle had ever spoken. Munduruku and Kayapo found themselves fighting not just with arrows and memory, but with court petitions, legal maps, and microphones. Amazon was no longer ignored. It was coveted. Governments, multinational corporations, and foreign investors all wanted a piece of what lay beneath the canopy: oil, gold, lumber, rare minerals. And they were willing to erase entire nations to get it. But the tribes had changed too. They were no longer unseen. Kayapo leaders like Rayoni Matuktire stepped forward into the global spotlight, not as beggars, but as warrior ambassadors. Clad in traditional feathers, lip disc shining, Rayoni walked the halls of Paris, London, and Brasilia as if they were riverbanks. He spoke for his people and for the forest. His voice, deep and calm, carried stories older than countries. And the world listened. With him came others, young Kayapo who had learned to speak the language of the invader. Legal documents, environmental reports, international treaties. But they did not abandon their roots. In the courtroom, they wore ceremonial paint. In government chambers, they carried spears. The Munduruku followed another path, quieter but just as fierce. They organized autonomous patrols of their territory, called Ipareg Au, our way of being. Young men and women, some trained in environmental science, others in ancestral law, began mapping their lands, documenting illegal logging routes, and broadcasting their findings through social media. What once was oral tradition became digital resistance. In 2014, the Munduruku delivered a stunning blow to the state. They halted the construction of a massive hydroelectric dam, the São Luís do Tapajós project, which would have flooded their sacred lands and drowned entire ecosystems. Their secret weapon? A blend of ancestral authority and modern legal warfare. They declared their territory independently demarcated, bypassing corrupt state institutions, and dared the government to deny their right to exist. The world was stunned. These were no longer tribes in the colonial sense. They were nations organized, intelligent, unbreakable. But with visibility came danger. Assassinations of indigenous leaders increased. Gold miners, garimpiros, invaded protected lands. Militias backed by political interests threatened villages with violence and arson. Even as the Munduruku and Kayapo gained international allies, their enemies multiplied at home. And yet, they endured. Because for every leader lost, two more stood up. Because the rivers still whispered names. Because the forest is still remembered. And now, for the first time in centuries, the Munduruku and Kayapo no longer walk separate paths. Their children learned each other's songs. Their warriors shared stories beside the same fire. Their shamans dreamed of the same spirits. They had come to understand a truth older than stone. The war was never truly with each other. It was worth forgetting, and forgetting would be their final defeat. Beneath the rivers of the Amazon, there are bones no archaeologist will ever touch. Bones swallowed by the current, tangled in roots, covered in centuries of silt and silence. But to Munduruku and Kayapo, these are not forgotten. They are remembered in chants, in rituals, in the quiet looks passed between elders when certain stories are told. For these warriors of the forest, the dead do not vanish. They walk beside the living, they listen through the trees, and they speak when the wind howls through the bamboo. Every battle, every betrayal, every act of courage has been buried in the soil, but never erased. The forest does not forget. Among the Munduruku, there is a belief that each river remembers its own history. When water rushes over stones, it sings of those who bled into its depths. And the Tapajós River, the lifeblood of their nation, sings the loudest. It carries the memories of warriors who once returned from raids with heads held high. of children who never returned from slave caravans, of leaders who stood before gunmen and refused to kneel. The Kayapo speak of the Xingu River with the same reverence. To them, it is not water, it is spirit. It flows through their myths like a spine through a body. It carried the first canoe of the first people, guided by the celestial serpent. And even now, when a Kayapo warrior dies, their ashes are sometimes scattered into the Xingu. A return, not a loss. But in recent years, the rivers have started to cry. Megadams like Belo Monte on the Xingu have slowed the current. Entire ecosystems drowned. Fish migrations disrupted. Sacred sites submerged under reservoirs the size of cities. To the government, these were sacrifices for progress. To the forest peoples, they were desecrations. The Munduruku and Kayapo, once symbols of resistance through warfare, became defenders through remembrance. In protest after protest, their leaders held up old maps. Not paper ones, but skin maps. Tattoos that told the stories of river bends, of ancestral hunts, of sacred paths. They brought bones to meetings, literal bones, dug from drying banks where villages once stood, laid before politicians who didn't even look. But it wasn't just the past they were defending. It was the idea of a future that honored it. Both tribes began pushing for an alternative vision of Brazil, one that did not divide nature from civilization. They proposed forest education systems in their own languages. They taught their youth to wield both the bow and the ballot, both the feather and the forum. A Munduruku child might spend 1 week learning to fish with a poison vine, and the next learning how to code GPS data to track illegal mining barges. A Kayapo girl might train for a ceremony with her grandmother, then travel to the city to give a speech to the United Nations. This was not assimilation. It was evolution on their terms. And through it all, they continued to honor the fallen. Every raid that was ever fought, every alliance ever broken, every warrior who gave their life to the river. Their stories were told at night beside the fire, in the ancient rhythm of syllables older than Portuguese. Because as long as the forest breathes, the war is not over. And as long as the rivers sing, the warriors are not forgotten. In the sacred houses of the Munduruku and the great longhouses of the Kayapo, children once listened to the elders speak of gods that could split the sky and spirits that danced on the edges of dreams. These stories weren't myths. They were memories wrapped in poetry, warnings carved into bloodlines. But now a new generation was rising, a generation that stood with one foot in the forest and the other in the fire. They were born in a time when the trees fell faster than they grew, when the air carried the scent of gasoline instead of rain, when the sky no longer darkened only with clouds, but with the smoke of burning land. These were the children of thunder and ash, warriors of a different kind. Among the Munduruku, young boys and girls no longer dreamed only of taking heads or hunting jaguars. They dreamed of drones, of court injunctions, of learning the enemy's laws better than the enemy themselves. The village of Sormwaibu, a central Munduruku stronghold, became more than a home. It became a resistance capital. Here, children were trained to identify the noise of illegal mining barges on the river. Teenagers learned how to file legal documents to challenge government permits. They carried smartphones, yes, but they still painted their faces in the red of their ancestors before speaking to cameras. To them, modern tools were not betrayal. They were just another kind of spear. The Kayapo were just as adaptive. Their youth, raised on stories of Kayapo heroes like Bebkarorodi, the thunder warrior from the sky, began to see themselves as part of a cosmic battle not just for land, but for reality itself. And in this battle, every video, every protest, every confrontation was a sacred act. In 2021, Kayapo warriors blocked a major highway in Para, Bir 163, the road that cuts through their ancestral lands like a wound. They didn't block it with weapons. They blocked it with bodies, stories, and songs. Dozens of painted warriors sat in the center of the road. The elders chanted, Children held signs in both Portuguese and Kayapo language, demanding an end to illegal mining, land theft, and the murder of forest defenders. They live-streamed it all, watched by thousands across Brazil and the world. This was the new war, and the battlefield was everywhere. The children of the Munduruku and Kayapo did not see modernity as the enemy. They saw amnesia as the true enemy, forgetting where they came from, forgetting what the river sounds like when it flows free, forgetting the taste of fruit that grows from untamed earth. So they fought to remember and to be remembered. They created digital archives of songs once only spoken by grandmothers. They mapped sacred sites using GPS so the state could no longer deny their existence. They painted murals in nearby cities, not for fame, but to plant the jungle's voice into concrete walls. And they knew something their enemies didn't, that a tree's roots can reach across centuries, that a warrior's story, once spoken, can never be silenced, that people who refuse to forget are people who refuse to die. They were no longer just defending territory. They were defending memory, and memory, once weaponized, can move mountains. For generations, the world had turned its back on the forest. Now the forest stood at its doorstep. What was once ignored as primitive had become humanity's last firewall against collapse. The lungs of the earth, the Amazon, were bleeding, and at the center of that wound stood two names carved in bark and blood: Munduruku and Kayapo. Suddenly, presidents, scientists, journalists, and billionaires wanted to speak to the tribes. Cameras followed them. Documentaries were made. International conferences gave them seats at the table. But Munduruku and Kayapo knew better than to be flattered. They had not survived 5 centuries of betrayal to fall for smiles made of cameras. The world came offering alliances, but the forest had taught them that some vines strangle as they embrace. When President Bolsonaro's regime opened the Amazon further to mining and agriculture, the Kayapo erupted in fury. They marched, not just in the jungle, but into the streets of Brasilia. They carried bows in one hand, smartphones in the other. They confronted police lines like they would a line of invaders from the past. One Kayapo elder screamed at the cameras, "You steal our trees, our rivers, our sky, and now you want to steal our silence too?" Across the forest, the Munduruku were fighting their own battles. In 2022, satellite images revealed that illegal gold mining on Munduruku land had expanded rapidly, poisoning rivers with mercury, killing fish, and leaving once sacred waters lifeless. The government hesitated. The miners had money. Munduruku had the truth. So they fought alone again. Young Munduruku warriors launched Operation Karusa, where they tracked and expelled illegal miners from their territories. Wearing body cams and accompanied by journalists, they filmed themselves dismantling mining equipment, confronting armed invaders, and broadcasting the destruction for the world to see. It was raw. It was dangerous. It was beautiful. International support poured in. UN envoys began citing their efforts. Climate scientists praised their courage. But still, nothing was easy. For every illegal miner removed, another crept in. For every promise made in foreign capitals, betrayal slithered back into the jungle. And yet, the tribes did not retreat. Instead, they grew more organized. They formed intertribal councils, bridging decades of silence between once rival peoples. Munduruku chiefs met with Kayapo elders under the same canopies, whispering old stories and new strategies. They forged an alliance not of convenience, but of destiny, because they understood something the world still struggled to grasp: that Amazon was not a resource. It was a being. It breathed, it wept, it remembered, and they were its heartbeat. The world came knocking, expecting broken tribes clinging to the past. Instead, it found nations of memory, resistance, and fire, willing to die not for profit, not for progress, but for the right to remain who they were. Beneath the glassy surface of the Amazon's rivers, something ancient sleeps. Bones of warriors, drums of bark, drowned by flood, traces of battle camps swallowed by the rising waters of progress. This is not just the story of two tribes. It is the story of what was buried, and what refuses to stay dead. When Brazil's military dictatorship in the 1970s dreamed of taming the Amazon, they built roads and hydroelectric dams that ripped through ancestral territories. The Belo Monte Dam, carved into the heart of Kayapo and neighboring lands, became one of the most destructive symbols of that era. It drowned villages, it silenced birds, it choked sacred tributaries with concrete. But the Kayapo did not go quietly. Long before the world had hashtags, they formed human blockades, standing in the river with their spears raised, refusing to move even as bulldozers loomed. It was during one of these standoffs that Chief Rayoni Matuktire, a Kayapo elder with a lip plate the size of a small bowl and eyes like storm clouds, rose to international fame. He wept publicly, not for himself but for the river. "The river is our blood," he told foreign cameras. "If it dies, we die." Munduruku faced similar nightmares. In the Tapajos Basin, plans for massive dam projects threatened to submerge sacred Munduruku territories under artificial lakes. The people protested not just with words, but with mapping. They created detailed maps of their land, not in the colonizers' language, but in the river's voice. They named every hill, every bend, every spirit that lived in a rock or tree. They called these maps ethno-zoning, living documents of memory. One warrior said, "If the state cannot see us on its maps, we will make our own." These weren't just countermaps. They were counterspells, woven shields of language and memory to stop the erasure of a people. And slowly, cracks appeared in the dam of greed. In 2016, after years of pressure, the Brazilian government shelved the São Luís do Tapajós Dam, a project that would have drowned the Sor Mwaibu village. It was a rare victory, temporary, fragile, but a spark. Yet for every dam stopped, another project emerged. Mining corporations, agricultural giants, politicians with gold in their eyes and machetes in their hands. The warriors knew the battle was far from over, but they had something their enemies didn't: an unbroken thread. A grandmother's lullaby in Kayapo, sung while stirring cassava. A scar on a boy's shoulder from a ritual hunt. A memory of a river that once sang instead of groaned. They fought to protect that thread, to make sure it didn't snap. Because beneath the river, in the bones of drowned warriors, in the teeth of buried spears, in the spirits of fish who remember when the water was clean, the Amazon remembers, and so do its children. The sun rises slowly in the Amazon, not because time moves differently, but because power does. Here, kings do not sit on thrones. They squat in hammocks. They paint their faces red with urucum and black with jenipapo. They lead not by command, but by memory. These are the last forest kings, the elders, warriors, and spirit keepers of the Munduruku and Kayapo. Their authority comes not from weapons, but from knowing. They know where the old turtle nests lie. They know which vine cures snakebite. They know which rock houses the soul of the jaguar. To the outsider, they are tribal elders. But in truth, they are living rivers, flowing backward and forward at once. In Munduruku council fires, the ancient stories are still told, of the giant snake that once swallowed the sky, of the twin brothers who created the rivers, of the spirit warriors who guard the forest when men sleep. In Kayapo gatherings, warriors still wear feather headdresses like suns, and the dance of the Bepkurodi is still performed, a ritual of celestial armor and ancestral lightning. Even as cell towers rise near villages, even as some warriors wear watches on their wrists, they do not forget. They use the tools of the present, but fight for the soul of the past. Today, Munduruku and Kayapo youth carry cameras instead of spears. But they record their ceremonies, their protests, their chants, and upload them to the world. Their voices are now heard not only in the canopy, but in the UN halls of Geneva, in climate forums in Paris, and in viral videos that ripple across the globe. But the elders are cautious. One Kayapo grandmother warned, If we become stars on the internet but ghosts in the forest, we are lost. So they balance between exposure and erasure, between memory and movement, between the forest and the future. Their war is no longer just one of spears and guns. It is a war of narratives, of land rights, of water, of what it means to be human. The world may call them indigenous, but in truth they are something deeper. They are the original defenders of balance. The Munduruku and Kayapo are not perfect, nor untouched by the modern world, but they are something else, undefeated. Not by colonizers, not by dictators, not by corporations, not by time. They remain, wearing the sky as shield, wielding rivers as weapons, singing the names of trees long forgotten by maps. So long as the forest breathes, so long as the rain speaks, so long as even one child remembers the old songs, the Amazonian warriors will never vanish, because they are not relics of the past. They are warnings, they are dreams, they are fire,